In spring 2014, students and staff from Centennial College participated in a global citizenship and equity learning experience focused on the important message that LGBTQ rights are human rights. The project was conducted to support the WorldPride Human Rights Conference being held in Toronto as part of WorldPride celebrations. To prepare, we traveled to New York City, birthplace of the modern gay rights movement. In New York City, we met with representatives from the Human Rights Watch, the International Lesbian and Gay Human Rights Commission, and the United Nations to talk about LGBTQ human rights.
So, because the environment is hostile to human rights and human rights defenders, it doesn't mean we won't work there. And in fact, if we're not based there, then that tells you the climate is pretty bad. But the critical thing in each of these countries is and the best part about our work is a cadre of human rights defenders on the ground who in many cases have been at it for decades. And you know, we're there to support them. We're there to amplify their demands for rights. We're there to make the space safer for them. And I think that's the most important function that an international human rights group can do, is to celebrate the work of courageous human rights defenders around the world, to make it safer for them to do this work, and to work on changing the legal environment so that they do not face the risks that so many of them do. I would put the crackdown on the LGBT community in Russia in that category of a crackdown on civil society. Because it actually, although the world started paying attention to it last June when the law went through the Duma and was signed into law by President Putin, the problem started years earlier with the passage of a so-called foreign agents law. And the foreign agents law in Russia targeted human rights activists, journalists, lawyers, those who were exposing abuses. And the LGBT community has been at the forefront of they're in the creative classes. They have been at really in the vanguard of demanding their rights. It's only been legal to be gay in Russia since 1993. So the LGBT community, particularly younger activists, came of age at a moment when they didn't have rights, and they were determined not only to establish their own rights, but also to create a safe space for colleagues. Part of why we made this anti-gay law and rolling it back, we tried to use the International Olympic Committee and athletes and human rights groups around the world to bring everyone together to get this law rolled back. I don't believe this law will stand in history. I think it will ultimately be seen very much like the apartheid era whites-only laws. It has a very pernicious effect on the society because it says it's open season on gay people who were only just able to claim their rights as human beings. So it's a major setback. And it is the involvement of the church is also something, the Orthodox Church is also something very ugly. But I do think that the law will not stand in history, but between now and then, there's an awful lot of damage that can be done in attitudes and education. When a state sends the signal that this type of violence is acceptable, it is teaching generations that it is okay to be responsible, to undertake such attacks. So I don't think we will have this law with us forever, but I think we really, every day that it is in force, it is a negative example for the rest of the former Soviet Union. We're seeing other so-called anti-gay propaganda laws being passed in other areas. So it's a terrible example. It radically degrades the life and the space for LGBT people in Russia. But the bright thing the positive thing that I will say, because I never try always to end on a positive note, is that it has mobilized and sort of warned people about the climate in Russia. There's been a backlash to that.
LGBT activists in the global south to help them monitor and document human rights violations that affect LGBT populations predominantly or exclusively, and then take that documentation, take that monitoring to the regional and international human rights advocacy spaces and be heard. So we're sort of like we think of ourselves as a bridging organization. Overlaying all of that, we have a feminist approach to the work. We push, I guess is the word, female leadership, trans leadership in the LGBT movement, where there are all of these different layers. You've probably heard of intersectionality, all the different types of discrimination that work together. So within our movements as well, there are these layers of discrimination, and so we're promoting a more diverse leadership in the movement. We have 4 regional programs. The Latin American Caribbean program, the African program, Middle East, North Africa, and Asia Pacific.
I think this LGBT violence project that Mayana spoke about earlier that we're launching for the Asian region is something that is really dynamic and something that no one else has been able to accomplish and put forth. It's really been able to shine a light on the realities of women who are not heteronormative in Asia, and a lot of these communities aren't talked about because the research being done in this region especially has to do with men who have sex with men or a specific subset of the transgender population. The report that we're launching and the research that has been going on for 3 years really has been able to talk about the violence within the family, the violence within the state, and the violence internally when you have to hide yourself from your entire community.
We're always asked, right, what's the worst place to be gay in the world? And the truth of the matter is, regardless of what the law says, if you're a gender non-conforming person who's been thrown out by your parents, you're living on the streets, whether it's in New York or Dubai or whatever, it's not a great place to be gay, right? Like, that's just the truth of the matter, regardless of what the law says. Of course, then there's sort of the legal context that makes it harder if you're in a place where, sodomy is punished by potential death sentence, etc. But on the individual level, a lot of people are invisibilized, and I think that actually, to me, but maybe this is because we're here, what's invisible often is the discrimination people face in countries where we suppose everything is fine.
This publication is actually very informative. It kind of gives you just a very quick overview of what human rights violations are across the world of LGBT people and anyone perceived to be LGBT, because what it comes down to is prejudice. And it also targets states in regard to highlight what their obligations are when it comes to protecting the human rights of everyone, regardless of sexual orientation. So I can really recommend it, and I'm happy to send along to them if yeah, of course. I have actually do this. That doesn't mean that the issues are solved, but it means that the UN nowadays, at least there's a consensus of the fact that these are important issues to work with and that we need to solve. And different countries might have different ideas of how and how far to go, but there's a consensus. When it comes to working on sexual orientation, gender identity, we're not there quite yet. But as I just mentioned, there is definitely a very positive trend with a very horrible example throughout the world of a backlash at the same time, as you've seen. We have very many countries. But what we need to remember throughout this is that the overall development is positive. But we need everyone to be with us, and we need the majority population. We need governments to really take a stand to protect the human rights of everyone. Happy World Pride from the United Nations and the free and equal campaign.
Awesome.
What does pride mean to you?
To me, it means being on the street and not being afraid of who you are, for sure. Feeling safe.
And what is the best part about living in Toronto and having something like World Pride come to the city?
It makes you feel like you're a part of a community, like you're not alone.
Pride is something I've always been looking forward to experience. This is my first time here in Toronto, and it's never been. I've come from a small town where that's never happened. Now to see World Pride going to happen here soon, I'm excited just to be a part of it.
So why is it important to have a focus on human rights at WorldPride?
Well, I think, we live in a wonderful city. It's so diverse and full of life, and I think it's really wonderful to have, the world coming to Toronto for, WorldPride 2014, and to make sure that, while we're also celebrating, we're also talking about human rights issues and things that people are struggling with both in Canada and abroad, so that we can share knowledge, share strategies, and engage in a global dialogue about human rights.
And what does human rights mean to you?
I would say, first of all, looking in your own communities and saying what's working well here, what's not working, how can we support people's equality, what steps can we take to ensure that people live healthy, happy, empowered lives. And I would say that both in Canada and then also thinking more globally about, what our brothers and sisters are experiencing around the world.
And anything you want to share about the conference?
I would just reiterate that we're thrilled that we have artists, activists, politicians, every walk of life coming to the conference, over 50 countries represented, doing fascinating issues all the way from trans rights to youth and education to LGBTI workplace issues, ranging gamut of experiences, and we're just thrilled to welcome the world to Toronto.
Great. And do you want to wish everyone a happy Pride?
Happy Pride.
In 1969, the Stonewall riots in New York City spawned the modern gay rights movement.
Happy World Pride. Happy World Pride.